Well, HSBC is launching a major restructuring plan that could see its business shrink in the US and Europe. Interim Chief Executive Noel Quinn says the bank's performance in these markets is unacceptable. He made the admission after third quarter profits fell by 18% compared to last year. The bank cut 4,700 jobs in August, and it announced plans to lay off another 10,000 workers last week. Now that HSBC is scaling down activities in two of its largest markets, even more of its workers could lose their jobs. And our senior business producer, Mobin Nasir, joins me now here in the studio for more on this. Mobin, first off, just how bad is HSBC's business in Europe and the US?
Ironically, it's actually quite good compared to its peers. Let's look at, if you look at returns on its US business, that's been about 1.8% so far this year. That's better than most US banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, some of its European peers also. Similar situation when you look at their overall return on equity, again ahead of its peers. But what we're really seeing is that while profit margins are really high in some Asian markets, higher than 50%, they're much tougher, they're having a much tougher time in the US and in Europe.
And of course, HSBC isn't the only banking giant that's in trouble at the moment. How many layoffs have there been in the industry more generally so far?
That's got to be a huge number. So look, we know that there's about 60,000 job cuts by European banks so far this year. That's not counting the 10,000 just announced. Other than that, and among that, 52,000 or more than 52,000 of those jobs have been cut within Europe. So clearly, most of these banks having trouble in their domestic markets. And then also, if you look sort of across the board, outside of Europe, you've got the likes of Alpha Bank in Russia. It's one of the biggest banks there, and they're cutting their workforce by about 12%. Over in India or in Pakistan, some of these economies where interest rates are actually higher, also talking about consolidation, about merging banks, and of course, leading inevitably to job cuts.
Now, do analysts see this as a cyclical downsizing as economic growth around the world slows, or do they think something more sinister is at play here?
So it seems like there's a bit of both of those, and perhaps a couple of other factors too. Look, so we know Brexit, trade wars, just overall the economic slowdown, all of these things are cyclical, as you mentioned, right? And those are affecting jobs. But then you've got some uncharted territory, right? So for example, negative interest rates, how do those work? We can clearly see that in places like Germany, even though negative rates were supposed to push people to spend more and save less, those saving rates haven't really come down. And on the other hand, those rates were supposed to encourage companies to borrow more and start growing. But clearly, because the demand side hasn't picked up, that hasn't happened either. So banks, again, really, in a way, getting stuck and failing to perform that duty of being a financial intermediary. And then, keep in mind, four of the biggest, the top 5 banks in the world now by value are Chinese. These are banks that for decades have been protected by their government, have unrestricted access to their own market without much competition, and now they're starting to open up. So all of a sudden you have a situation where banks which are sitting in very, very competitive markets like the EU with very, very thin margins, because of these low and negative interest rates, are having to compete with these other banks which have none of those issues and have seemingly never-ending piles of cash. Every time they get in trouble, they can get bailed out either by their own government or through a consortium of their peers.
Interesting. Let's see how HSBC moves on this next. Mobin Nasir, thanks for your analysis as always.